We're talking about the provision of abundance, the provision of abundance. And really the objective is that we would learn to trust God to provide. Trust God to provide. Provision of abundance and trusting God to provide. Now let's remember the context, as Pastor Rob taught us last week. The Syrians have come to conquer the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel, the capital of Samaria. They have besieged the city. And what it speaks of is a large army that has completely surrounded the city, so that no supplies come into the city and no one is able to escape from the city. And over a course of time, the circumstances get desperate. There's been famine in the land. There is now a famine as a result of the siege. And the circumstances are so dire that people are reduced to cannibalism. It's horrendous. And so in the midst of this circumstance, in the midst of this desperation, God promises abundant provision. Look with me beginning at verse 1. Then Elisha said, "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Now, first of all, Elisha says, "Hear the word of the Lord." This is not just Elisha expounding his own thoughts. This is God speaking to his people. God speaking to the king. God speaking to his people. That food is going to be so abundant that it'll be affordable. These are people who have been reduced to eating the feces of animals. These are people who have been reduced beyond simply eating feces of animals to cannibalism. And now they're being told, hey, you're going to be able to pick up a loaf of bread for $2 at the market and a gallon of milk for $4. And it's like, how? How could this possibly be? Sometimes God's promises of provision just seem too good to be true. In the midst of our desperation, as we saw that recently, our nation and the globe went through what has been described as the Great Recession. Many people lost their job. The unemployment rate in this county exceeded 1 in 10, and the underemployed rate was close to 1 in 20. 1 of every 5 people. So you could imagine in a church of 1,000 or more adults, 200 people struggling. That's a large group of people. It's a large percentage. And in the midst of that, the promise of God's provision, you could imagine the struggle in that circumstance. Can the offer of God's provision seem just too good to be possible? When we were in 2 Kings chapter 4, we saw that there Elisha, the man of God, the prophet, had been sent to this widow. And this widow had nothing. She was preparing her last meal to make a loaf of bread that she was going to eat and then die of starvation. And Elisha says to her, hey, why don't you bake me a cake? And then God will take care of you. Now, you got to think about that for a moment. You're down to your last $10. You're down to the last jar of peanut butter in the cupboard. And someone claiming to represent God says, hey, why don't you make me a peanut butter sandwich first and give me that $10 and then God will take care of you. And you're thinking, like, no way. And it takes great confidence for this woman to trust not simply Elisha, but to trust God. And she bakes him a cake. And then there's this inquiry, okay, what do you have? And all she has before she sells her sons into slavery is 1 little jar of oil. And so the man of God says, okay, get every vessel you can. And go bring them. And his plan is that God is going to miraculously provide. He's just going to, from this very small container, keep filling these vessels, no matter what size they are. And then she's going to have enough oil that she'll be able to sell it, pay off a debt, be able to provide for her family, and to provide for her future. She's going to be fine. Now here's the thing. How many vessels would you gather? I mean, you just start to think about it. How many mason jars, how many 1-gallon containers, how many, containers of plastic and ceramic and whatever else you might grab. How many would you get? And after you get like 10, you're thinking, well, It's probably not going to be more than that. Or, would you grab 20? How about 30? 50? It's like, could you imagine you start to put out 50 containers? They're all over the kitchen, all over the counters, all over the dining room table. They're all over. And then you hear the still small voice of God say, get some more. And you think, oh my gosh, there isn't enough room for any more. Could God really provide more? And sometimes it just seems too good to be true. I remember when the church first started and we were meeting at this park, group of about 35. And after the services, we would gather on Sunday morning after service, and we would hold hands in a circle. And the group wasn't that big, so it was relatively easy to do. And I remember one Sunday when there were 75 to 100 people, and we held hands. And I remember after praying, looking up and thinking, that's a big old circle. Look at all these people. That's amazing, God, how you provide. And then I remember when we got space at the shopping center, more space, and then we had the opportunity to purchase this land and to develop this land from the ground up. And that just seemed impossible. We didn't have the resources. The church was small. How could this possibly be? And the masonry, these stones, some of the people who are still in this church, in this room right now, put these stones together. And I remember before the roof was put up, I remember looking from the top down in the sanctuary, and I was thinking like, my gosh, that's a big room. Where are there going to be enough people to fill that room? That's just impossible. God couldn't do that. And I realized that through the years how God has shown me that he wants to do exceedingly abundantly beyond what I could ask or think.